Hello, it's Friday. Welcome to Serious Social. And grab a cup of tea. We're going to be talking about creating compelling communities. So, whether it's Facebook, WhatsApp, or LinkedIn groups, communities are forming really fast through the pandemic. We're feeling a need to gather together and stay close to people across shared interests and connections. Outside of the big networks, we see private messaging for discrete audience such as Guild accelerate in the B2B space. In fact, they've just published a super interesting piece on CBN, community-based marketing. I'll pop a link in the comments. It's the same is true for consumer brands. That's why I'm delighted to be joined by Nick. Let me just add him to the stream. Hi, Nick.
Morning.
Um, He's award-winning content marketer with over 20 years of experience in building brand communities. He's helped businesses including Adobe, Levi's, and Google to develop content-driven branded communities that not only build awareness and authority for brands, but also enable customer acquisition and retention. So welcome, Nick. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Katie. It seems rather odd. We've just gone back into lockdown, and a certain gentleman in America is trying to explode himself at the moment. But other than that, things are good, thank you.
Good. Yeah, it's insane. But we are already seeing many brands considering community as part of their marketing mix. It's almost like we want to kind of cling together in all of this, don't we?
Yeah.
And for those not yet convinced, where do you see the value, Nick?
I was sitting thinking about this the other night, and I think there's 10 potential wins. It's obviously very dependent what sort of community you want to build. We've spent years talking about trying to create highly engaged audiences, and I actually think community is probably one of the most effective, and it actually works across the whole of the customer journey. So it's not just about awareness and sales. You can also build loyalty, advocacy, and a big thing for me at the minute is retention. Particularly when we're going through such troubled times, keeping hold of your existing clients is, I think, even more important. It can obviously improve customer service and lower your costs. I mean, we've seen plenty of communities that actually manage those basic problems. So things like giffgaff and Spotify do that really well. Believe it or not, it can actually reduce your marketing costs. There was a piece of research done, I think it was a few years ago, but something like half of the branded communities have seen cost savings of something like 10 to 25%. So, I mean, you just think about it, all of a sudden you've got a lot of user-generated content that potentially you can use elsewhere. Obviously, you've got to get permission for that from the people who created it. You can also get increased engagement on social. By getting people in the community to share content, it's a good way of trying to recruit new members and build brand advocacy. And of course, one of the big challenges we've all seen with the big social networks is who owns the data. And obviously, you own not only the relationship, but also the data for your community if you choose to do it on a standalone site. And, from a brand's perspective, to understand your members' wants and needs, is really valuable, not just because the fact it can input into your own business strategy. So it helps you maybe co-create and innovate new products. You can test new products and services. And, I've even worked with communities that have generated new revenue streams. So whether it's subs or ads or sponsored content, there's lots of opportunities. In terms of where the actual value is, there's, again, lots of different ways you can do it. So obviously the key thing is you need to have proper analytics in place. And, you've got to be able to measure things. And, you can measure generated leads. You can look at sales. So, average revenue per community member, time to response or solution if you're using it as a customer service platform. You can measure loyalty, retention, and obviously net promoter score, which is big in the world of customer experience these days, can help you measure advocacy. But there's also actual community metrics. So there's a thing called a member satisfaction score. There's also a thing called a sense of community index, which is delightfully known as SOCI. which looks at kind of four different things. So the benefits members get from actually being a member, so that sort of sense of belonging, an investment in the community. It looks at influence, and that's influence in terms of not only the influence for individuals, but the whole group itself. Fulfillment of needs. Is it actually a rewarding experience? And frankly, if it's not rewarding, most people ain't going to bother using it. But and then finally, is there some sort of shared emotional connection? Do people actually feel more connected because they've used it? And I mean, all of those are really valid measures, but you need to have at least some of those.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're not going to survive. It just isn't going to work.
And it's really interesting because it is. So according to the CMO study I was reading the other day, key objectives during this time are building brand value that connects with the customer. That's 34% of CMOs want to build that close connection and retain current customers, which is about a third again.
Yeah.
It feels like that is why there is a greater demand for community. But given that, what should be the objectives? How should you set out purpose? Because I keep seeing communities and it's they just kind of wander about. You don't really know why they're there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing, you need to think about community almost like the way you do CX or customer experience. It's not just a marketing strategy, it's actually a business strategy. You actually need all the customer facing parts of the business should be involved in it in one way or another. And more importantly, all the members of the community itself have to have a role. It's not just about the experts and the influencers, although they might help drive things. Lots of people have different roles. But I think, you mentioned brand purpose, and brand purpose is something I've always thought is key. I mean, hopefully people understand what that is. I mean, to me, it's about that intersection between your customers' unmet needs, the things they're trying to do in life, and actually what's special about your brand and what you can deliver. I mean, Nike are a perfect example of that. I mean, their brand purpose is to bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete, and they define every athlete as if you've got a body, you're an athlete. So, even like me, if you struggle in walking around Epping Forest one afternoon, I'm still apparently an athlete. But a really good example of something they did, my eldest son was big into American football. And in the US, they created a community where college football players could upload all their stats. It's one of those games which involves lots of stats, and they could compare themselves to the professionals and also their peers. So it was a really valuable tool. And again, it might not be most people's sense of a traditional community, but it can be really powerful. And obviously, the engagement you create has to be really meaningful. I mean, again, to your point, some of them just kind of wander around. You just think, well, what's this about? And there's a recent piece of research, last couple of months, came out from the AAAA, which is the American Association of Ad Agencies, not alcoholics and something else. But there's 70% of consumers buy brands they know and trust. So again, I mean, that's no surprise to any of us, but it just shows how important having, really good objectives are, because these communities can be really powerful.
Indeed. So to get us thinking, you worked across so many different types of community setup. Maybe you can share why they're kind of different and what the focus is when it comes to setting objectives.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is they've all been quite different, and some of them you might not even said were communities. So the first one that I built was a thing called Student UK, which was actually for UCAS, the people you apply to university for. And basically it was a big, valuable research, not just for prospective students, but for existing students. And when we first launched, the content was actually produced by a bunch of trusted influencers. We even had Jay Rayner, who some of you may know, who was his early journalistic careers, but we had the current features editor of the Times, who back then was a music journalist, Karen Kruzanovic, who was the Agni aunt of Sky Magazine, if anybody remembers that. But once we kind of built the community and people got a sense of what it was about, we also involved a lot of students in actually producing content. We also had, back in the day when we had chat rooms, and those were actually moderated generally by the students themselves, who were very good at it. The next one I was involved in was a thing called Levi's Antidote, and basically the objective of that was to try and reconnect with influencers. The big challenge they had was something they called the Clarkson effect. Basically, if Jeremy Clarkson was wearing our jeans, you were not perceived to be a particularly cool brand anymore. So that was about reconnecting with consumers. And what we did was actually work with a whole bunch of what was called fanzines, if you remember those, if you're old enough to be me and were around in the punk era, but self-published small magazines, some of them literally, hand produced, photocopied and stapled together. And we did some amazing things with that. And it was a very defined audience who was involved with it, but we helped them, or it helped us actually expand the audience for Levi's in terms of, we were cool. We were still at the cutting edge. One which people really probably wouldn't get as a community was the thing I worked on for Google, which is a thing called Squared Online, it's basically a learning site that equip leaders of the future with the tools and a mindset to embrace opportunities around digital. So that was very much community-based learning. They kind of all worked in groups together. So, a lot of how they were judged was not just by the work that they did themselves and kind of marked by us, but also by their peers. And some of probably the most recent one people might be familiar. I was editor of CMO.com in Europe. CMO is owned by Adobe, and it's about providing insights, expertise, and inspiration for and by industry thought leaders. So, we not only had some of my senior marketers in Europe who we would interview, but we also had a lot of people like Katy who were actually writing for the site. And, it had, a very defined audience, but it was about Adobe being able to build that kind of relationships and trust. That obviously had some advantages when they went out to talk to clients. I mean, if we'd actually interviewed that person, that certainly would help. And there's lots of other brands you can look at to see how they did it. I mean, Lego, Harley Davidson, Salesforce, Airbnb, Sephora. There's lots of good examples.
It's really, there are. What's really interesting is that it's quite a challenge when you start to unpick what a community is, and more specifically, creating a strategy isn't something you can kind of do in your spare time or even on the fly, is it? I mean, what are the best strategic approaches you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the back of the fag packet, that's for sure. I mean, hopefully if people listening are marketers, they probably have heard of the 5 Ps. I like simple frameworks like that. So I've been sitting and thinking about this, and I came up with my community 7 Ps, which I think gives you a framework to help build a strategy. The first one is about the people involved. And ultimately, this is not just about the actual buy-in you're going to need from the C-suite, because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a strategy that's going to affect the whole business. And they also need to have some involvement in it as well. The next thing you need to think about is persona. So, you need to identify a specific persona or audience group that you want to target this at. I think it's far better, certainly initially, to target a group of customers, partly because it's hard to please everybody all the time, and not everybody is going to want to be engaged. I always remember years ago there used to be ways of defining people on social media, and you often had groups of people who were called lurkers, who sat and read social media posts but very rarely contributed. And the next thing we've already talked about, which is purpose. So it's about reflecting the user's values and principles. You need to spend a lot of time identifying what the challenges they're facing, and then think about very clearly about how you can help solve them. And that comes down to thinking a lot about content. And we'll talk a bit about that later. But content, particularly at launch, is really valuable. Equally, you need to think the next P is P for platform. So what channel is going to be most appropriate? I think the real channel, I worked with the guys at Digital Donut, and one of the challenges they own one of the biggest LinkedIn groups. It's the biggest digital marketing group on LinkedIn. But they also have the Digital Donut site. And of course, key challenge was, how do you transition a huge audience from one platform to another? Certainly all of the ones that I've been involved with have had their own platform, but that's something you need to think about. What's the best one that you might use? The next thing is, once you've launched this thing, how are you actually going to promote it? How are you going to get it to market? What channels and tactics are you going to use? Often they're going to be the same things you're used to using, but you need to think about what story you're going to tell. What benefits or inducements are there to join? I mean, some brands it might be relatively easy. If you've got a really cool brand, that people want to be associated with, that might not be hard. But if it's the sausage you have for breakfast in the morning, that gets a lot more difficult. And the next thing is the second last thing is participation. So as I mentioned earlier, content is really empowering. It's key to communities, partly because they'll share it. It's how people engage, and it's about helping create that kind of common vision that hopefully people buy into. So you need to have a really well thought out engagement and content strategy that's going to keep people at the heart of the community, but also enables you to nurture and maintain kind of a long-term relationship with those people. And then the final thing, which I kind of mentioned earlier, is payback. So what's the return on investment? And that's not just about the ROI for you and your business, but it's also about for the community. And again, you need to be really flexible. Communities don't necessarily have to have a short shelf life. But again, you may find that the community will drive it in directions you never thought of before.
God, that is, sorry, that's brilliant. I will definitely, Nick, be putting that in my blog on Monday, because that is new. And that one of the challenges of strategy is exactly that. And it's really interesting that only that somewhere in the region of 50 to 60% of brands with communities have no agreed strategy at all. Why is that?
I think there's a whole bunch of points. I think some may just see it as another social channel. So they just use the same strategy they've already got for their social media. It's kind of staggering that some people may still have the build and they will come syndrome. It's hard to believe. I mean, I've been doing digital stuff for way too long, but I've been doing communities for over 20 years now, and I still see stuff which just doesn't see through. Doesn't make sense. Equally, I don't think something's a strategy if you can't measure it. So unless you've got those measurements up front, how are you ever going to know whether that strategy works? I also think sometimes that again, going back to this thing about being another social channel, sometimes CMOs can kind of get this under, the radar a little bit and don't necessarily get executive buy-in. So, there's no kind of agreed set of objectives. And all of a sudden you'll find different members of the C-suite going, you've got that thing, that could have been useful for us. So you've got your customer service person going, why didn't you talk to us about it? So again, these things get pulled all over the place. And of course, the usual one, which everybody always laughs about, is the sales guy, just turns around and goes, I want this as a sales channel, which again is just not appropriate.
No, and I think we've talked a lot about the fact that there is just too much sort of community adventuring, but without any purpose and no direction, and people really don't know where they're going. But setting up a community is one thing. Looking after members and growing and evolving it is just another one. So how do you grow and keep interest? Better still, how do you create loyalty?
So how do you grow and keep interest? Well, at launch, you've got to think the community, or at least its members, are a bit like children, right? Or babies. So they most definitely need feeding. They need lots of attention. Because eventually you've got to get them to a stage where they can almost stand on their own 2 feet. So at that very early stage, content is going to be key. I think that's why somebody like myself, I gravitated to this because, you know, I understood content. That's the world I came from. And, you know, you need to be able to start debates and help them set agendas and find out what they want to talk about. So at the very early stages, you might find yourselves creating quite a bit more content than you will at later stages of the community. You also need proper resourcing and good community management. You know, best practices around this sort of stuff is key. I mean, you know, you need to be attentive and helpful, but I always think you need a relatively light touch. You know, you can even use your members once you've actually got the community established. We had this with Student UK. We had lots of chat rooms, and quite quickly the actual students took over managing them. And we had one person who was literally the biggest troll imaginable. And we went to her university because we could capture the IP address of the computer she was at. Or what we found out, it was a she, which shocked us. So we contacted the university and said, look, this person is just like hideous. Can we try and stop her? So actually, we did. So one day she was on being really rude to people. So we gave them the IP address and they went and found her. And she, one, could not believe that she'd been caught, and two, they couldn't believe who it was because they said she was the most mild-mannered student who wouldn't put food to a goose. So, you know, there's opportunities there. I mean, you know, once the community's established, you should get to a level where they're contributing a lot of the content. And a lot of the activity is coming from your members, but they're still going to need direction. You will still need to create bits of content that move them on. And obviously, once it's fully established, you know, they almost will define where it goes. And you may find that it's a good time to split them off into different groups. So it might be based on topics or geography or whatever it is. And that's a really good way of keeping communities going and kind of building loyalty. So, you know, you really need to start thinking quite early on, what are you going to do to keep people coming back? So, you know, a really authentic brand community is about mutual concerns, common values, shared experiences. But, you know, you need to make the members feel special, valued, wanted, you know, where you can give them a voice. You know, very common, you see people using reward programs and incentives and perks, and they can be a lot more than just monetary. You know, give them exclusive content or reports they can use. That was, you know, something that was very much key to, I guess, community like e-consultancy. You know, on a personal level, give people top contributor badges, you know, reference them in content you're creating. You know, I mean, Starbucks were great at gamifying rewards, so use those approaches. Encourage them to share tips and hints and reward them for doing so. I mean, giffgaff, when they first started, had a guy who drove up and down the M4 trying to find black spots in the network. He didn't realise, of course, it was O2's network. So they were the same ones. But what giffgaff did, if you contributed a lot of tips and hints and helped out the community, you got money off your bill every month. And I guess the ultimate one is give great customer service. I mean, you know, that's ultimately why people want, or one of the reasons people want to get involved.
Yeah, and there are lots of thriving communities. Maybe I'm being a bit negative about it, founded by really passionate amateurs who have far fewer resources than most brands do. So why is it so many branded communities fail to kind of commit resource and investment? Why do they fail?
I think, you know, you need, I mean, you're asking about, you know, why they have fewer resources, what you need. I mean, ultimately, the scale of what you're producing, it certainly is a job for more than one person. You're going to need to invest in a platform. I mean, at Digital Donut, we used a platform called Kentico, which is brilliant at helping you manage communities. And you need that level of professionalism, which, you know, an amateur site doesn't worry about. It doesn't matter if it looks a bit rubbish. It doesn't matter if there's mistakes or nobody replies for a few days. You can't do that with a branded community. Why do they fail? God, lots of reasons. some of which I've already mentioned. So lack of buy-in from the top or across the business. They don't have permission to kind of flex and change things as the community grows. Obviously, no clear strategy or goals we've mentioned, or an unclear purpose, mission, or vision. I mentioned earlier, no KPIs or benchmarks, no measurement tools. I mean, Deloitte recently did a study that found 30% of online communities have just one employee in charge. Most have just a single PR person running the show. That's not the proper level of resource and management that these things need. In some cases, companies, they either massively overinvest and get really frustrated because the payback doesn't come quick enough, or they'll invest too little. The old promotion issue, build it and they will come. Well, really? Is that what we're expecting? You need best practices. You need to give these things time, and don't give up too easily or too quickly. There's also that kind of reach mentality that some businesses have. I won't name which client, but I had one that was obsessed about how many people they were reaching. And I said, well, actually, your target audience are FTSE businesses. There's only like 300 of them. So why do you want hundreds of thousands of members? It's just pointless. And I suppose the obvious one is they treat it like a sales or a marketing channel. It's not. It's a lot more than that. And it needs respect.
It's interesting because it should be an adjunct to marketing. It should be an adjunct. It should sit alongside it. I've always thought that. Yeah. I'd wanted to talk to you about sort of the emotional and the psychology, but I think we might have to defer that to another session. So I'm going to have you back, Nick. Okay. But one thing that all of this kind of makes me think, having a proper strategy, having the right resource, investing in the long term seems like there is a lot to put aside before you set up a community. Yeah. So let's be blunt. What should brands be considering when it comes to budget if they want a community of value? And how long should they wait for it to bear fruit?
Yeah, it's dependent on what you want to build. You're likely to have platform and hosting costs. In terms of a team, 2 to 4 people to manage it. You're also probably going to need some freelancers to create content, certainly when you start. Obviously, you need to put aside a marketing budget. Again, as I've said before, but if you just because you built it, people ain't going to turn up. I've seen budgets of anywhere between 300,000 to 500,000 per annum. That's certainly not unrealistic in year one. But of course, you also need to factor in savings, which is something people rarely seem to do when they do things like this. You would expect reduced savings in things like customer service support costs, in terms of marketing costs, research costs, R&D. So there's lots of things you need to factor in when you're building this. And again, it'll help you getting buy-in from the C-suite when they see that it's not just another hole you're going to pour money down. And in terms of how long can it take? Well, I would say you can take it any from 6 to 18 months to really get traction and start to build it. I'd recommend you build it organically and quite incrementally. Don't try and build, Rome. Try and build a little village to start with and see how it develops. And ultimately, the successful brand communities are always going to continue to evolve to meet its kind of members' needs. But it's not an easy process, and it takes patience.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, thank you, Nick. It's been brilliant talking to you. It's funny how it's only when you look under the bonnet that you see how many moving parts there are to keep an engine going. Because I'm not surprised that it's not as simple as setting up a Facebook group, but I've loved hearing about the different approaches. So I think the results speak for themselves. When a community thrives, there is value. You can see it in those that are successful.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Nick, for being my guest. It's been brilliant. And join us next Friday, where CJ will be chatting on hopefully another sunny Friday on the latest social media hot topic. Thanks. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.